My name is Anita Raymond, and I am the director of the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision Making, which is a program of Volunteers of America, Minnesota, which is a private nonprofit social service organization designed to and existing to help people build hope, resilience, and well-being through integration of health, housing, and human services. We have a very large organization and a great deal of services, and because we have limited time today, I wanted to shift away from the entire organization and to the program of which I am the director. At the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision Making, we are a team of social workers, and we host Minnesota's Guardianship Information Line, which is a free resource that is available to you, to families, to community members, to professionals, to people at risk of or subject to guardianship, and at doing individualized consultation with regard to any question people might have adjacent to the guardianship arena, which is a very broad arena, which includes healthcare directives, capacity, decision-making, supported decision-making, avoiding guardianships, promoting best practices in guardianship. So as the director, I have the privilege of working with social workers who, again, are here to support and assist anyone who has those kinds of questions. And it is in that realm I come to you today to talk about guardianship and whether it's actually necessary. A lot of times when there's a diagnosis of an illness in the dementia spectrum, it causes people, whether it's professionals working with families or families themselves, to start to wonder, might we need to seek guardianship? A lot of people hear about it, know a little about it, maybe know a lot about it, but begin to presume there's this thing out there, maybe we need to pursue it. So what we want to talk about today is, I know I'm skipping around a little bit on the slides. What we want to talk about today, I've shared with you who we are and where I come from and how we can help, and a little bit more on that at the end in resources, but specifically in shifting gears to talk about a bit of a high-level overview of guardianship conservatorship, what it is, might you need it, don't you need it, how can we avoid it, and then I also want to spend a bit of time on supported decision-making as part of the umbrella, part of the spectrum of decision-making available to support people without necessarily having to be involved with the courts. So let's start there. Let's start with what is guardianship, what is conservatorship. By definition, it is a court appointment. It is appointing a substitute decision maker for an individual who has been found through a pretty lengthy court process, who has been found by a judge to be incapacitated by nature of a disease process or an illness or an injury, something that impacts the cognitive or intellectual or psychiatric ability to understand one's situation and make decisions. So it's a pretty lengthy process, after which, if it is successfully proven that this is the need and that this is the only way to get the person's needs met, the court might grant, depending on what was requested of the court, might appoint a guardian to make a set of, and it may be one, some, or many areas of decision-making defined by our law, that the guardian receives the power and responsibility to make decisions over a person, health care, where they live, who provides care, things having to do with the person is under the purview of guardianship. And then by the same process, sometimes it happens at the same time, then there might be a request for a conservator, which is the court-appointed substitute decision maker, to take care of somebody's assets, their home, their real estate if it needs to be sold, managing investments, bank accounts, income, etc. And we call a person who has a conservator a person subject to conservatorship. And we call a person who has a guardian a person subject to guardianship. Sometimes people use the word ward because that used to be in our statute several years ago, but that's a pretty negative, a word with some negative associations. So we call people subject to guardianship rather than ward. So I said earlier, the question often comes up at the time of diagnosis of, do I need guardianship, conservatorship? Should I seek guardianship conservatorship? And the fast answer to this question is we want to turn to the courts. We want courts involved in our lives when we need it, but really only when we need it. And there are several reasons for that. One of which is something of a moral issue or an ethical issue, is that when we ask a court to appoint a guardian or a conservator, and the powers or authority that we grant to the guardian or conservator is this simultaneously a right that we are removing from an individual. So for some people that can feel very damaging to their self-esteem. And again, morally and ethically and legally, we don't want to take away people's civil rights unless we absolutely have to. It's a pretty expensive process. It may or may not be borne by the family seeking guardianship or conservatorship. It will be borne, the costs of it will be borne by the person needing a guardian or conservator if they have assets to pay for the costs. And if not, and it's still necessary, depending on what county a person lives in, the costs might be waived, so family doesn't have to pay it and the individual can't pay it. But the money comes from somewhere, and it's an expensive court process. Because it involves the loss of rights, there's a lot of due process protections. That's kind of a fancy legal word for saying we want to make sure that the person, that we aren't taking away a person's decision-making rights prematurely or unnecessarily. So there's notice requirements, there's court visitor has to meet with the person and make a report with the court. There's a court-appointed attorney. And the individual themselves, as well as next of kin and some other important people, all get notice, legal notice that this is happening. So as a result, it can take a long time. It can take months to put a guardianship or conservatorship into place. Depending on the person who needs help, depending on their awareness of it all, this can be very upsetting to them to read and have people be talking to them about their disabilities, about the things that they aren't able to do well or that they make mistakes about, that they might not have that self-awareness. And so it might feel like lies and accusations. So it can be very upsetting to the person. It can be stressful to you if you are a person concerned about the individual and you're the one who is working on getting this level of protection, and the person is getting mad at you or involving talking to lawyers and going in front of a judge. That can be very intimidating for people and therefore stressful. And then we'll talk about later, it can also exacerbate conflict that might exist within family structures. And the good news is we want to, and our law says, we want to use guardianship as the last resort, and we have a lot of tools and methods and approaches to help us avoid guardianship when we can. A couple things, if you're contemplating guardianship, we want to remind people that if there is, sometimes people seek guardianship because there is conflict with a family. And I'll talk more about conflict in a little while, but sometimes we think, well, let's just let the courts decide who should be the decision maker. And that's an approach, but just merely having the designated legal decision maker doesn't necessarily take away the feelings of anger and resentment and pain, and the other person doesn't feel listened to, and they feel now cut out because they weren't appointed the guardianship. So it doesn't end the family conflict. What it does do is clarify who legally is the decision maker, which has certainly some merit. When we think about guardianship because of a person, we want to try to correct, we want to try to resolve a problem. A common problem people think about is the person who's living with a dementing illness, they're refusing to take a bath, or they're refusing to take their medicine. Maybe we should get a guardian. They're refusing to let a home health aide help them. A guardian authority, or the conservator authority to pay for that care, but the authority of the guardian can consent to the person receiving those services. But we can't magically make the person now more willing to have a bath or be more willing to have someone help them get dressed. So it doesn't help resolve problems or concerns we have related to doing something we want them to do or stop doing something we don't want them to do, like bothering people or swearing at people because of the nature of their frustration and their illness. Sometimes we think, I've heard guardianship is a last resort and I don't know what else to do. I can't find a home care company that has the ability to staff this, or I think it's really time, at least for respite, or maybe long term, I need to find a place for my loved one to live, and I can't find a place that can meet their needs. Having a guardian authority isn't going to create resources that don't already exist. And I know that sounds obvious, but it is sometimes something we think people turn to. Like I said, they think about it's a last resort. We're really up against the wall. I don't know what else to do. Let's get guardianship. And we want to stop and think before we do, because of the loss of rights and the expense and the time and the trauma and the stress. We want to not use guardianship if it's not even going to solve the problem that we're worried about. It's also important to know, sometimes we think about, the person I'm concerned about is being taken advantage of. Somebody is in their life, whether it's another family member, a longtime friend, or someone they met on the internet or at the coffee shop. Sometimes we think, I need guardianship so that I can get that person out of the individual's life because they're not good for them, right? Yes, guardianship authority can be very broad, but it's not all inclusive. A guardian has decision-making authority over areas that are specifically granted by the court. They have to be asked for in the paperwork or the petition, and then proven in court, and then granted by the judge. If it's not in the order of what power the court granted, then the guardian doesn't have authority in that area. And sometimes we think about, like I said, I don't appreciate that relationship my dad is in with that person he met. I don't approve of that. I don't like it. I don't think it's what mom would have wanted if she were still alive. But I can't use my guardianship power to try to force my values and my wishes or my lifestyle. I want my dad to keep going to church because that's important to me. I can't use my power to force my values or goals onto another person, because the guardianship statute, and there's even a guardianship bill of rights that says the person is still entitled to their own beliefs and input. And so I mentioned that when I get rid of that person that my dad met at the coffee shop, for example, I really can't use my guardianship authority to restrict his right to free association. I can't use guardianship authority to restrict interactions with others unless I can be prepared to prove that there's a substantial risk of significant harm that will come if I don't restrict the interaction. And I have to be prepared to show that there are no other ways to address that risk while still letting the person have the right to associate with the individual of their choosing. And if I do want to restrict interactions, I feel like it does rise to the level of very likely substantial risk, significant harm. There's no other way to mitigate or avoid or lessen the harm. And I'm going to put restrictions in place. I do have to give notice to the person being restricted, to the person that is subject to guardianship, and the court. So these are just, I'm getting off a little bit on a little sidebar there, a little diversion there, but just as a reminder that because of these limitations, we want to make, and because of all the associated types of costs associated with guardianship, we want to not turn to it unless we absolutely have to. So why might we need it? Why does this sometimes come up in conversation? Why might I need a guardianship or conservatorship? A fast answer. Well, because there's no other way to get the person's needs met. We've tried everything else and we still have significant issues or barriers, so we might need guardianship. For example, we have to have the condition, we have to meet the criteria spelled out in the law, which talks about there's a decision that needs to be made or there's an unmet need that the person can't do. They can't make that decision or consent to that service or make sure they have their basic needs met for food, clothing, shelter, safety, supervision because of their disease process. And there's no other way to get those needs met. And that might be because the person can't recognize, because of the anosognosia, the nature of some dementing illnesses like Alzheimer's disease, that for many people prevents them from even recognizing they have any problems. So therefore, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't have any unmet needs. Leave me alone. I'm not going to let anyone help me. And yet, by any objective measure, the person is in pretty significant danger for malnutrition or bed sores or, some of those serious skin breakdown. We seriously need to address the problems associated with their disease. And there's no way we can get those needs met outside of guardianship. And they didn't previously appoint a healthcare agent. So kind of the flippant answer of when do I need guardianship is when there's a failure of everything else to meet their needs, to address the concerns. So some examples of situations that have led people to have to go to court and ask for guardianship is I've mentioned a couple times, conflict within the family, or conflict with somebody outside the family who has inserted themselves, but not just conflict all by itself. We still want to try to resolve the conflict. And again, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if we absolutely can't resolve it, and that conflict is so significant that it's significantly impairing, it's a detriment, it's a harm to the person living with dementia because of all the chaos around them, or there's so much fighting that the person is constantly upset, or they aren't getting their needs met because no one can agree on what the needs are. Sometimes we might agree with what the needs are, or we might be able to get to agreement, but now we can't pay for it. Maybe it is a spousal arrangement, but the other spouse doesn't have access. Maybe they have kept separate accounts all their lives, and there's no way to access the funds that are needed to pay for the person's care. So then we might need to go to court and ask for conservatorship, maybe, if there aren't any other ways to access the funds. We'll get back to that. Sometimes people are, unfortunately, more and more and more. The more we have access to the internet, the more we have artificial intelligence, the more we have cell phones. Like, we are learning that there are, I call them diabolically brilliant people out there, entities out there, who are concocting ever more creative ways to scam people or exploit people. Sometimes individuals are financially exploited by someone who knows them, someone who met them, and sometimes they're exploited or being scammed and separated from their money with internet scams, cell phone-based scams. And those scammers, again, are so diabolically brilliant, and it gets into the psychology of the person's head, that we can't talk them out of that. We can't reason, we can't convince them, and they keep sending money, and we keep sending money, and there's no way we can stop them. We might need to go to court and get conservatorship authority over their money so that we can protect them from themselves being victimized further by these evil, brilliant scammers. Sometimes providers, sometimes doctors, sometimes social workers, sometimes bankers will say, I can't talk to you unless you're a guardian or conservator because this person has dementia. That may or may not be true. I would encourage people, if they hear that, to pause, maybe contact our guardianship information line. Don't necessarily assume that the person telling you you have to get guardianship knows and understands and is intimately familiar with the guardianship law. They might not know about alternatives. They might not know that guardianship is no longer viewed as the go-to response, that's no longer the default intervention for people, that it really comes with it's good and necessary when we need it, but it really comes with some potential problems. And providers don't always know of that. They sometimes just think it's this benign, helpful tool, go get guardianship and everything will be fine. So take a pause. They shouldn't be in a position of mandating that someone get guardianship or conservatorship, but that sometimes comes up as a barrier to care when they try to insist on that. Like I said, the guardianship information line is a great resource for you, and you will be getting these handouts later on if they have your email, if Kathleen has your email. So you will be getting handouts with the information about how to contact and get help for your particular situation if you're feeling pressured to get guardianship and you don't know that's actually needed. I have given you some, and I have prepared some information about the petitioning process for guardianship. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip through this right now. I'm going to answer a couple quick questions that are showing, for those of you who are watching, are showing on your screen. But I'm going to not spend much time on petitioning, and during the Q&A, if we have time, I'll come back to it, because this isn't necessarily applicable to all of us. It's really only applicable in situations where we think we do have to seek guardianship. But a couple high-level questions that often come up. Guardianship and conservatorship, again, guardianship of the person, conservatorship of the estate, it can happen at the same time. If we need protection powers of both areas, we can do it all in one petition. It might be one person is a guardian, a different person is conservator, or one person is the guardian and conservator. Sometimes there's people asked to be co-guardians, myself and my daughter, for example, in case anything happens to me. Or sometimes people think about co-guardianship or co-conservatorship to have, so both dueling parties can have a say, but that doesn't tend to go very well, because once they're appointed as co-guardian or co-conservator, they have to agree on everything. So we tend to recommend avoiding co-situations if we need to. Again, we have to be prepared to list a diagnosis, why it is, what is the condition that is causing the person to have unmet needs, what are those problem areas, and we have to be prepared to list in the paperwork, which is called the petition, and talk about in the court hearing, what did we try to avoid guardianship, conservatorship? How long did we try it, and why didn't it work? We also have to list what areas of authority we need. So, like I said, I'm gonna prepare to come back to the petitioning process if people have questions. And again, you will receive the handout after the meeting, if we have your email. And just a couple things to clarify too, that once appointed as guardian or conservator, there's extra work associated, not just with decision making and care decisions for the person, but also some extra work to be done to file certain reports back with the court shortly after appointment, and then at an annual basis. Okay. What I want to really spend my time on, because again, guardianship is good when it's needed, but it's really more than a lot of us need in a lot of our situations. So we really want to try to avoid bringing the court into our lives. You all as caregivers have enough going on, enough to try to sort through, without also having to have the court in your life and have to report back to the court, having to answer to the court if somebody files a complaint against your actions. So we want to avoid that whole thing if we reasonably can. And the best way to do that is to plan ahead. And then if we can't plan ahead, didn't get a chance to plan ahead, to think about less restrictive ways to help meet the person's unmet needs without having to go to court. And then if we have to go to court, then we do. Okay. So planning ahead at the time, I mean, all adults, all of us from the day we turn 18 should be thinking about what might happen because an accident or unexpected illness or an age-related illness can happen, but it can happen to us when we're 18. At any time of adulthood, we tend to think about planning for the future as we get older or when we get a diagnosis. But better yet, all of us should think about planning ahead. The best thing we can do, even with somebody who's been diagnosed, again, presuming they're not in the later stages and can still converse and express their preferences, talk about it. What are your wishes? Whether it's you, a caregiver, or the person living with dementia, wishes, values, hope for the future, hope for the progression, where you want to receive care if the disease progresses the way the healthcare providers believe it will. Write it down, talk about it, informal discussions, writing it down just in a journal or on your computer that someone can access later. But just writing it down is a really great step. That's better than nothing by any means. Talk to other family members, especially if what you think you want, if your family won't agree with that. You think they'll have concerns about that. Make sure that, again, it's going to be very situation and family specific, but generally an overarching good piece of advice is talk to your family members about what you want, what you hope, what you value, and for the person living with dementia, what they hope and want and value. You might want to consider at the time of diagnosis, and I'm sure you as caregivers and being involved, you've gotten this advice from a lot of the different people. What do you do when a diagnosis happens? There's a whole bunch of things to do, including planning ahead. Seeking professional advice for advanced healthcare planning might be of interest to you, and maybe meeting, depending on your assets and your financial situation, maybe not, meeting with an elder law attorney, a financial planner, to think ahead about the financial costs of paying for care, but also how to set things up so that it again honors your and the person living with dementia, their financial values, because people have different views. Should we spend some money now to save lots of money in the future? That's the idea of paying someone to help you, paying a professional, paying an attorney, meeting with a financial planner, maybe meeting with a professional care manager, a fee-for-service care manager. Yes, it costs some money. This might be a very insulting suggestion to some people who feel like they're living day to day, but for people who can afford it, it can be a very useful expenditure of your money to pay someone to help you get it right, to put plans in place for the future. And then that's also part of discussing wishes, values, and hopes with your family. Everybody has very different values, for example, about finances. And some people think, I want to spend my money to have fun before I get really sick, but I also want to have some money set aside for the rest, for care for the remainder of our time, and for my caregiving spouse. And so we want to have those conversations with professionals to get it lined up, but then going back to the earlier comments, but maybe sharing, and maybe not, it's very personal, maybe sharing those views and values and intentions with family so that there's not conflict later, or so the conflict isn't left to you, the caregiver, the spouse maybe, or the adult child who is the primary caregiver and primary decision maker, so others aren't thinking that's not what the person really wanted. You're just saying that, right? But having had those conversations in advance can be really, really helpful. So again, a professional attorney or financial planner, a care manager to help navigate through that. Really great idea for, again, all of us. If you're an adult, contemplate having a healthcare directive. And that is still relevant for people even after diagnosis, as long as they understand what it is they're signing. If they have a consistent, reliable understanding, maybe they can't list anymore the complexities of what they would want as their disease progresses, or if a different disease emerges on top of the dementing illness, or whatever might be going on. But they may not be able to complete the healthcare instructions part of the healthcare directive document, but they might be able to very reliably, validly, consistently say, if I can't make my own healthcare decisions, or sometimes I phrase it very simply, if you couldn't talk to the doctor, if you're too sick to talk to the doctor, who would you want your doctor to talk to? And if that person can reliably say, whatever, my spouse, my kid, my next door neighbor, best friend, whoever that is, that might be plenty legal capacity to complete that part of the healthcare directive, the naming an agent part. And then it has to be notarized or 2 witnesses. It's pretty simple. It's not very complex. People don't need lawyers or professionals to fill it out. There's some great resources online, including right here at Health Partners, has some excellent resources on their website. And if you receive these handouts via email, you will be able to click on anything that's underlined. You can see where my mouse is. You can click on it, and that'll take you directly to that website. So again, information, forms, advanced care planning helpline. So a lot of resources that cost nothing to help people. Another important tool, instead of or in addition to a healthcare directive, is signing a release of information. So you probably know that a doctor can't talk to you about the patient, even if you're married to them, even if you're their adult child, unless there's a release of information. And sometimes that's the barrier to helping people. And again, even a person with, pretty moderate stages of a dementing illness, if that's what's going on in your family situation, they might still be able to have enough understanding to say, yeah, it's okay for the doctor to talk to my whomever or whomevers and signing that release of information. So that can be done with your social worker, with your healthcare providers, the hospital, the pharmacy, if you're able to be in a position to help refill prescriptions and renew prescriptions and so forth. Releases of information can open a lot of doors for care partners to help an individual that you don't need guardianship for. Planning ahead. I think this is a different topic than we have time for today, but I didn't want to have some conversation about planning ahead without reminding people that there are some pretty good resources for people who qualify within the state through state federal money to the state, to the counties, to help pay for care for people who qualify financially and care needs based. So MnChoice's assessment going through what used to be called Senior Linkage Line is now called Minnesota Aging Pathways, or the website of Minnesota Department of Human Services Home and Community Services page. So thinking ahead about what's needed. That's off topic from guardianship, but it's related to the degree that if we can have things in place or we can access when we need them, extra care and support, then it doesn't matter very much if the person can't set up the care themselves. If you as a care partner or other care partners on your team can help them access needed care, we might not need to have guardianship. Again, strongly recommend, depending on a person's financial situation, it's going to be different for everyone, but doing some estate planning ahead to make sure that your money goes the way you want it to, and also setting things up so that people can help manage finances, pay for care, protect money without having to go to court. So there's a whole bunch of different banking tools. We can make sure, I mentioned earlier, sometimes we have to get conservatorship because spouses have lived their lives with separate accounts, and they don't have, and each spouse doesn't have access to tap into to sign a check or authorize a payment. Checks are getting outdated now, aren't they? But I just wrote one last week. But to access somebody's bank account in order to pay bills, to pay rent, to pay the mortgage, to pay utilities, to pay for care that's needed at home. If we have separate accounts and no authorized signers or co-signers, we're kind of in trouble. And the person is not willing to let them help because of their dementing illness. They don't understand the need, and or the disease has progressed too far and the person can't consent to get help. That's when we have to potentially get conservatorship. So setting up options in advance. Another one I mentioned with regard to banking tools isn't doing it for the person, but it's letting them maintain independence in monitoring, in paying their own bills because they like that, they find meaning in it, they've always been good at it, but maybe setting up an online access to the account with the permission of the person so that you or someone else trusted can log in daily, weekly, monthly, every couple months, and just kind of go through and make sure there's no red flags, make sure they're not having all of a sudden significant large or frequent smaller or frequent large withdrawals made to indicate that there could be some scamming going on. So the person can retain independence, but someone else is sort of monitoring. Depending on the financial situation, if the person has assets that need protecting, a great tool, and this is a corollary. So we have a healthcare directive where today I appoint someone to step in and make decisions for my healthcare in the future if I need it. Similarly, signing a power of attorney to appoint an agent, or legal, the technical term is an attorney, in fact, who has the authority at the time of signing, but we might agree between us. I'm not going to have them start acting on my behalf until later when I need it, when I can't manage things on my own. So appointing a power of attorney. And again, this is where lawyers are really, really important to talk about powers of attorney to make sure we're doing it right. We're not making major mistakes that have financial implications. Similarly, if we have significant assets or we particularly want to plan ahead to make sure we put money aside legally that can't be tapped into, so that it's protected for our spouse who's not going to need long-term care, or it's protected and set aside for our adult child with disabilities or minors, if we still have minors we're concerned about. So there's some technical, highly technical ways to set up estate plans through trusts, through powers of attorney. Beyond, I've been teaching this stuff and immersed in this work for 36 years, and I wouldn't do it without a lawyer, right? It's really important. It's spending a little money now to save money later for if things are done poorly, and then we still have to go to court to get conservatorship if we didn't do it correctly. Okay, so couple options that way. So I mentioned family conflict, and I want to spend a little bit of time here and then have some time for questions as well. I talked about earlier that family conflict that we can't resolve can be a reason families get stuck and can't move beyond the conflict and sometimes have to turn to guardianship, which then may or may not help, as we talked about. Some of those potential pink flags or red flags for conflict might be blended families. We have a widowed spouse who remarries, so we have adult children of the new spouse, we have adult children of the other spouse. One of those two spouses is diagnosed with a progressive dementing illness. Now, who's the primary caregiver? Who's most involved? Maybe the biological children are estranged because of decisions that were made before the deceased parent, and they really are not, and so they're out of the picture, and so now the step siblings are more involved with that biological. There are all kinds of arrangements that can work beautifully. It can be a beautiful Brady Bunch situation, or it can be just ripe for conflict. These are the kinds of things to be aware of. If you're in a blended family, it might be a good time to try to have some conversations very early on about preferred caregivers, preferred trajectory of care and where living and those kinds of things. And again, those can get complicated, and that's where it can be helpful to have a professional help with that. The whole issue, we talk about caregivers, who's the primary caregiver, and then who are the other people in our orbit, our other family members who aren't the caregiver, they're not on site. They're not with us day to day, but boy, they sure have some observations and opinions when they come home for Thanksgiving next week, right? So we have in the moment, ongoing day to day caregiving, and then we have the long distance caregiving, or the what I sometimes teasingly call the opinionators. They come in with their opinion. We have concerns and we have conflict about, I want to continue living my life and make decisions. I want to live the lifestyle I've lived. Maybe it's not one you agree with. Maybe it's one you think puts me in more danger now that I have a dementing illness. And so you want to step in, or the other family in our orbit, other people in our orbit want to step in and make sure safety is more important than my wishes, right? So finding that, bridging that balance, finding that balance between reasonable safety and reasonable autonomy. Sometimes that can be a source of great conflict. Similar to the caregivers versus the opinionators is the local versus the long distance family. That's maybe those could have been the same category. The people who are in it day to day, and then the outsiders who come in who care equally as much, or have equally as much standing, but also they're not here day to day. Sometimes they can be the best. They can have the most objective view, because when we're in it day to day, we might not see a significant decline as it happens because we're in it day to day. Maybe they can be a great gift to step forward and say, hey, I'm noticing some things that weren't happening when I was here over the 4th of July. But it can also cause conflict. Sometimes families are complicated. Sometimes we have an adult child who moves back in to help give us some support, and or an adult child who has had some struggles in their life, and maybe they never quite reached adulthood as some of us define it, and they've always lived with the parents. And now, as the parent has more struggles cognitively, intellectually, and that adult child has opinions, or that adult child is just doing their thing, and the other siblings have their views and worries, right? So these are all right. Another big one is keeping the diagnosis secret. Let's not bother the kids. Let's not worry the kids. I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed, which, by the way, please know, and I know you know that. But when we keep the diagnosis a secret, or we keep our money a secret, again, personal decisions, people get to decide what's best. But when we keep it a secret, or when we start thinking about, I'm gonna find ways to legally disperse the kids' inheritance to them now, and then have medical assistance pay for my care, or we need every penny to pay for long-term care, but sometimes kids start to think that's my inheritance, and maybe they start thinking I should be getting some of that money now, or I should start thinking about inheriting this house now. So the conflicts that can come with good intentions, or maybe less good intentions. So we want to try to not get into those positions. The conflicts are going to happen, that's natural, but try to see them in advance, think about what could happen, try to talk early. This is a reality in our family. We've got some potential trouble spots brewing. We've got some speed bumps. Maybe we should have very intentional about talking early and talking often about our wishes, our plans, the reasons we're doing things. Sometimes we have a lot of unresolved childhood angst, childhood trauma. Maybe we have abuse patterns in our family that we don't want to talk about, but that might still impact us now at this time of our lives. So family therapy, it's never too late for couples therapy or family therapy. Maybe we want to have some family meetings where we all sit down together, maybe facilitated by someone at the clinic. Maybe we want to bring in a fee-for-service care manager to kind of navigate through some of these issues, talk through what do we have brewing currently, what should we be thinking about in the future. Can we have someone be objective to help us move through planning for the future with all our potential trouble spots and hopefully not having it turn into irresolvable conflict? If we didn't do that, or it didn't work well, we couldn't avoid it, and the conflicts have reared their fiery heads, there again, maybe family therapy, maybe bringing in that outsider, that care manager if we can afford it. Maybe a case manager can help with some of it, although that's a lot to ask from their role, the county case manager through waiver services. But someone, a minister, a pastor, sometimes can serve that role. Sometimes it's just that third party, that objective third party. Sometimes we need formal mediation. The conflict is so irresolvable, we have to turn to somebody to mediate it all. And when all else fails, we might have to seek guardianship that we can't resolve and get the person's needs met. I've talked about a lot of, but not all, but I've talked about many of the ways we can try to avoid guardianship. There's a lot of different approaches and endless ways to approach trying to avoid guardianship because we want to avoid. It is the law that we have to try to avoid guardianship if we don't need it. It's a human right. Well-intended overprotection is still overprotection. Guardianship in many cases isn't needed in order to meet a person's needs from all the ways that I've been talking about. And I know I've been a high level, we haven't delved deep into your particular questions and issues, but just I hope I've sparked some thought here in thinking about it. And just because somebody doesn't have a guardian doesn't mean they don't have a whole significant, intense, in-depth set of supports to help them. And a lot of that falls under the umbrella of something we call supported decision making. That might be a newer concept to some people, but it really is for many people what you're already doing. All the things, if you have a friend, you have a spouse, you have a 17-year-old, you have somebody who's maybe gonna, or you yourself, or you have a big decision to face and maybe you're kind of going down a path that isn't the best for you, somebody that might turn to you, or you might turn to your friend, or you're approaching adulthood child, or you turn to your spouse and say, you know, maybe we should talk through this a little more. You know, other people who are dealing with this situation might have tried it this way, or it sounds like maybe we have that's condescending how it word the sentence I was about to finish. Maybe we have a misunderstanding. Again, that's condescending. You wouldn't say it that way, but explaining technical things, things that are beyond our normal everyday understanding in the realm. We can turn to our supporters. We can turn to other people, whether we have a memory impairment or not, a diagnosis of a capacity-related decision-making struggle or not. We can turn to others to have people help explain, help us navigate, talk through, be a sounding board, persuade, reframe things for us. Whenever we go to the doctor with a person, we don't have to have legal authority to go to the doctor, as long as the person allows us to go to the doctor. And then we're sitting there listening to the doctor and we can tell our person isn't understanding it. Then we reframe it. We re-explain it on the way home, or we ask the doctor to slow down, or we ask the nurse who's talking to please talk into my parent or my partner's other ear because they don't hear well out of that one. My person has a speech impairment that the doctor isn't quite understanding them and is thinking it's based on confusion, but the doctor just doesn't understand them and I do, so I can help. That's an example of supporting a person to get what they need. We help a person understand a consequence of their decision. This person loves their home health aide. They find them very helpful. They're good to be around. They have a good relationship, but they're starting to feel like it's none of your business, nurse, to come and take my pulse and my blood pressure. Maybe we just have to explain and reframe. This is just one of the things we have to do. How about we let the nurse do the examination? And that way, Cindy, your home health aide, is able to come later and keep doing the things that work out so well for you. Whenever we're setting up technology to help support people so they're safe, so they remember appointments, so they can find their way home, so they can't drive anymore, but we can set up an easy to use rideshare app. Those are things we're doing to help. We're working with them with their agreement. I'm going to help put some things on your phone, and then you can still have that sense of community and safety and independence. Right? The permission from someone to monitor banking. These are all just examples of the ways we can help get a person's needs met, even if they can't do it all by themselves, but without having to necessarily involve the courts in our lives, which again, good to do if we need it, bad to do if we don't. So supported decision-making and avoiding guardianship, using supported decision-making, it's a philosophical way of thinking differently about supporting people with disabilities. Instead of they can't, it's rather, yeah, they can in many cases with extra support. All the things we might do to help a person either make a decision or agree to or not refuse the necessary supports they might need to be able to keep living the life they want to live. So a couple resources I've mentioned several times, our guardianship information line, phone, toll-free, local, email, can help with an individualized consultation for anything that might have come up for you today while we're talking or that might come up in the future. Another resource, and there's a lot of care management companies out there. I happen to be partial to ours because this is part of my department as the director of the Center for Excellence. Our primary care manager, Melissa Johnson, can serve in that role. I don't want this to turn into a commercial for you. I just want you to know that that's a resource. I want to thank Health Partners, the Center for Memory and Aging, and for bringing us together today, and also to the Department of Human Services for our supported decision-making grants that allows us to do the work we're doing. And it would be very, very helpful, and I'm going to go past this slide and come back. So yes, Kathleen, thank you for putting it in the chat. Please take a few moments to complete our evaluation. That helps me as a speaker. It helps when I report to our funders. It helps Health Partners know that they've made a good choice or maybe not such a good choice. I hope that's not the case in bringing a speaker to you today. And I also really want to take a moment to acknowledge we're almost done with the month, or we're more than halfway through, but this is National Family Caregivers Month. So thank you. Many or all of you who are here today or watching today are self-identified family caregivers. You're so important. The work you do is huge, is enormous, is hard. Hoping to have people all take a moment to make sure also that you're caring for yourself. You're keeping your cup of energy and emotional sustenance and physical health sustained so that you can keep being the caregiver that you want to be.